Guys, we finally got all the parts we need to finish the harmonic balancer project, so let's get this Z06 back on the road. We're going to do all that and a whole lot more next.
Toys for life.
Finally, the postal service came through. We've got the new ARP bolt. Just want to talk about a couple quick things. There's a lot of contradictory information on the interweb. ARP specifically recommends 235 foot-pounds. Use the supplied moly lube on the threads, the front side of the washer, and on the underside of the head. That's critical so that when you torque this thing down, it actually gets tight enough to stretch the bolt, which will keep it tight. So that's what we're going to do. Next, I'm going to install the tool to hold the balancer while I torque this thing down. This is a really awesome tool from Summit. Here's the part number. And no, this is not sponsored by Summit in any way, but this tool just works that damn good. And then use a smaller torque wrench inserted into the tool to hold it against the frame rail. And you can see how I have the tool installed, and the breaker bar inserts into the tool, and then it resides against the frame rail to resist the torque when I torque this down to 235 foot-pounds. Starting at 100 foot-pounds, or pound-feet if you prefer. Moving on to 200 pound-feet. And finally 235 pound-feet. Now we'll go ahead and remove the tool. Now it's time for my favorite part. Let's slide the rack back in from the driver's side. She definitely kicks and screams a little bit, but just make sure you're slow and steady. Watch for any pinched wires or power steering lines until you get it back in its mounting location. Okay, the first line you're going to want to put on is the one that's closest to the driver's side, and it comes from the front going to the rack. And you can get at this one here from by the A-arm with a stubby and with an 18mm line wrench, and then you can finish it by coming up above. And believe it or not, you can get your hands in here and get a stubby down there to tighten it up, and then finish it off with a line wrench. So that's the first line you want to put on. Now let's put the next one on, and for that we're going to raise the car all the way up and do it from the front. Again, when putting these lines on, these three 18mm wrenches are your friend, so make sure you've got them handy. Next, let's go ahead and install the bracket that supports the ABS unit. Next thing we're going to do is reach down and connect the steering column to the rack and go ahead and insert the correct bolt. I like to use a drop of blue Loctite and torque it down to manufacturer specs. Next, let's go ahead and tighten the main steering rack bolts to manufacturer specs. I made a mistake. I should have put the air conditioning belt on before I put the steering rack back in. It would have been a lot easier. Obviously, it's still doable. We're going to do that next. But one thing that I want to show you, I'm going to go ahead and clean off the air conditioning pulley by spinning it and having a cloth with solvent on it. Because as you know, there was a little bit of a power steering leak, engine oil leak, and we changed the water pump. So we want to make sure we get all the contaminants off of this pulley. It's obviously a good idea before you try to put the belt on to line it up and make sure it's the same length as the old one. And that looks close. So that was kind of hard to see. So basically what I did is I slid the belt over the entire harmonic balancer first, and then it goes between the two idler pulleys, one on the top, one on the bottom. The bottom one is a tensioner actually. And then of course the air conditioning compressor pulley, and then you release the tension of the tensioner while you slide the belt on and you're golden. I tightened up the power steering cooler bolts. Now let's work on the cradle to frame bolts. I'm going to remove that screwdriver I've got in there as a wedge, and then I'm going to go around to all four nuts, tightening each one about a turn at a time until the cradle is cinched back up to the frame to the manufacturer's torque spec. And again, resist the temptation to use an impact wrench. You can wreck the way the bolt is fastened to the frame and cost yourself a whole bunch of trouble. Next up, we can remove the support system that we had for the EBCM or ABS module. And go ahead and retighten the bolts on each side. Next, we'll go ahead and refill the power steering fluid reservoir. And of course, it's going to need to be checked as the fluid works its way through the pump and the rack. Next, we'll install the drive belt tensioner. We replaced it because we didn't like the way this pulley sounded. Make sure that each part looks identical and go ahead and install the part. And of course, use a torque wrench to tighten the bolts. And the next thing I did is threw the belt back on. And it's always a little tricky, but all I did is refer to this one over here. Here's the diagram. Next up, we're going to reinstall the shroud that contains the two radiator fans. Take your time, and I promise you, it'll find its way back in. And again, it basically resides in a couple of little U-channels that it slips into and gravity holds it in place, as well as the plastic cover on top of the radiator. We'll go ahead and reattach the radiator hold down. Next, we'll reinstall the air bridge. Back underneath, let's go ahead and fasten the wiring harness for the fans and all the different little clips that it snaps into, and plug in each fan. Now let's torque down the ball joint to knuckle connection. I like to start by just snugging it up a little bit with an end wrench. I'm just tightening up a little bit, I don't know, maybe like 5 foot-pounds. Then I make a mark with a marker, so when I put the torque wrench on and torque it to 15 foot-pounds to start, I know that the ball joint's not spinning. Next, using a torque angle gauge, turn it 160 degrees. And then as a final check, you torque it 33 foot-pounds and it didn't move at all. And I think that's just a check to make sure that when you did the 160 degree rotation, that it wasn't spinning inside the joint. And we're getting super close now. Time to put the sway bar back on. And don't forget the end links. Let's get these wheels back on, but one other detail here I want to show you. Don't let this happen to your car. All of these studs are 100% dry, so they start rusting, they corrode, you don't get the proper torque value when you're tightening them, and if it sits long enough, they might seize and you might not be able to get them off. So you definitely want to put just a little bit of grease, not much, just a teeny bit goes a long way on each stud. Run the lug nut back and forth a couple times and then put the wheel on. The chirping birds appear to be gone. Wobble-itis seems to have disappeared, and it's time for this Z06 to go for a ride. If you're going to try this job at home, I've got a couple key things for you. If you don't have a lift, I think you can still do it, but you're going to need to raise it up on jack stands safely with some good quality jack stands, and you're going to be working from under the car and then back on top, up and down a lot. You're going to need not a bucket like this, but you're going to want to build yourself just a platform that's about as tall as you've got the C5 up in the air. That way, every time you need to go up top, you can access the engine bay. So that's number one. Number two, as you saw in the video, you're going to need a few specialty tools. A harmonic balancer puller, a harmonic balancer installer, preferably a tool to hold the balancer when you're torquing it or removing the crank bolt. And number three, when you're tightening up all the bolts on your C5, you want to torque them to the proper spec. The best place for that would be a factory service manual. All Data DIY is a pretty good source. You can usually find the torque specs on Corvette forum, but you're going to want to verify that those are correct. And then lastly, I'll include a link in the description below to a couple of what I think are pretty reliable sources for all the different torque specs for the bolts on the C5. As always, guys, if you learned something from the video, please hit that thumbs up and subscribe. And as always, thanks for watching.